Welcome to the Writing 1 presentation, Causal Analysis. Please follow along with this presentation by opening your How to Write Anything book to Chapter 5. As we're talking about causes, you want to make sure that you have a good vocabulary to use when discussing different types of causes. And some people haven't really gotten into this yet. A lot of us have written cause and effect papers of one type or another, but a lot of us haven't really dug this deep yet in. So we want to make sure that we really, pay attention and get into this here, because these are terms that you can use in your paper to help your audience better know how you view things. So here's a quick list, and we're going to go discuss them individually. First one is necessary causes. And this is a cause that can best be defined as any factor that must be in place for something to occur, hence the term necessary. Their example that they give on page 140 is a scientific one having to do with photosynthesis. And they talk about how, sunlight, chlorophyll, and water are all necessary for photosynthesis to happen. If you remove one of these elements from the equation, the natural process just doesn't take place. But since none of them could cause photosynthesis on their own, they are necessary causes, but they're not sufficient causes, which we'll talk about later. So they define it another way as causes that seem so important that we can't imagine something happening without them. So they give a sports example here, saying that maybe there's this amazing pitcher on your baseball team, and your team simply couldn't win a World Series without that specific pitcher on the roster. So that would be considered a necessary cause. Any cause, again, any factor that must be in place for something to occur. So in order for the effect to happen, the necessary cause has to be in. Another type of cause is sufficient cause, and that's when a factor is in and of itself enough to bring on a particular effect. And that's kind of a vague, bland, boring type of definition, but think about it for a minute. When something, a cause, is in and of itself enough to bring on a particular effect. And let's think about an example here. Not being 18 would be a sufficient cause for being arrested for drinking alcohol in the United States. So, and again, some of you probably have been warned or have had experiences about this, that if you're at a party and you're under 21 and you have alcohol, just you being a certain age and holding alcohol is sufficient cause for you to be arrested. So one thing is sufficient cause for another thing to happen. To give more of an example related to a paper that you might write, oftentimes we see several sufficient causes all kind of rolling up into one effect. So they say a plane may have crashed because it was overloaded, it ran out of fuel, had a structural failure, encountered severe wind shear, and so on. Any of those would be sufficient causes. And that doesn't mean it's a necessary cause where because it was present, it absolutely happened. I mean, there are times when you're low on fuel, but you don't, crash your car. But if you run out of gas and you're on the middle of the freeway, then you could crash your car. So there's what's called a sufficient cause, where it may not necessarily relate in an effect or end up in an effect, but it is sufficient cause for an effect. Another type of cause might be a precipitating cause. And this is where maybe a cause would seem trivial or small, but it causes an effect to occur. Other necessary conditions and types of causes may have been accumulating for a long time. So we could describe it as a proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, if we're familiar with that saying, that a camel might be carrying a heavy load and it's just about to collapse, but you put one more piece of straw, and even though that little piece of straw doesn't seem like it would be much, it's just enough to break the camel's back. And that's where we get that saying that probably a lot of us have heard. For example, when we're talking about the civil rights movement, there were many things that were going on for a long time to create a spark for the civil rights movement, but it just happened to be, some people would basically say that it was the Rosa Parks incident, where she had worked all day, she was tired, and she refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama. Now again, one little incident on a bus wouldn't seem like it would be that big of a deal. It wouldn't seem like it was, enough to spark a civil rights movement, but things had been building for so long that it was just waiting for one little spark to take off. That is a precipitation. Then we have what's called a proximate cause. And some of you have heard of the term proxy. That could be from the same root word here of someone being in a nearby place. Approximate is another word, obviously, that would get into this. But this is called a proximate cause. It's a cause that is nearby or close to the effect and often easy to spot. And their example on how a corporation declares bankruptcy when it can no longer meet its massive debt obligations. Well, you can look at that. Well, it can't meet its debt obligations. Okay, that's a cause for bankruptcy. So it may not be completely necessary, but it's nearby. It's pretty easy to identify usually. Another example that they go with here is a minivan crashes because a front tire explodes. So your front tire explodes, and so your car crashes. Well, it's pretty easy to say, well, that seems like a cause. It's pretty spot. Now, again, it may not be the only thing, and it may not necessarily, it may not be necessary for that effect to happen, but it's proximate. And, we can say, well, yeah, proximate causes may also be sufficient causes. A lot of times there's some overlap on that. Proximate causes are often a starting point to start researching and looking, and that's going to lead you to deeper issues and causes. Whereas the proximate cause is something that's nearby and fairly easy to identify. A remote cause is a cause that may act from some distance from an event or an effect, but it's intimately related to it. So it is very directly related to whatever the effect is. The example they give back to the one about a bankrupt corporation that defaulted on its loans. Well, yeah, you might be able to look at, one event nearby and say, wow, that was a really big deal. That was a problem. But maybe it had been doing bad things for a decade. So again, maybe, there are long-term and more serious causes. Those would be your remote causes. Another thing that you can look at here is a student resorted to plagiarism because she ran out of time, because she was working 2 jobs to pay for a Hawaiian vacation, because she wanted a memorable spring break to impress her friends. It's a string of remote causes or a chain of causes. So again, you may not be able to identify those early on, but you have to be careful about those. And talking about that last example, there are times when I see students who seem like they shouldn't be struggling that much, but they're struggling, and it seems like there are some causes that I can't immediately see, but they're influencing the things that I can see, and they are the remote causes about something. So, I might see a student sleeping in class and say, wow, the student is probably going to fail the class because they sleep half the time in class. What I don't see the remote cause is that student works 2 jobs, and one of them, they've just been working 12 hours before they walk into class. And so, and the cause for that might be, again, like the examples that they have. Maybe their family's been, hit with some medical bills and they need to work extra time in order to get past those. Lots of things. So we have to be careful that we dig deep and try to find those remote. Let's talk about reciprocal causes. And the word reciprocal, if you're not familiar with that word, you should definitely look it up and get a better understanding of that word. But basically, when we're talking about a cause and effect type of relationship, a reciprocal cause is when a cause leads to an effect, which in turn strengthens the cause. So, for example, that by creating science internships for college women, well, that might encourage more women to become scientists, who then sponsor more internships, creating yet more female scientists. There's a graphic, and I've kind of given my own example of it here, try to draw it and put it in here, where again you see one cause leads to an effect, but that effect leads to yet another cause, and maybe a bigger cause, to an effect. And you see, depending on how you look at it, it might keep, getting bigger and bigger. Some people would look at it and say, wow, that's really a spiral. You make one bad decision and it leads to an effect, but that effect leads to more bad decisions or more unfortunate things happen. And because of that, that becomes a cause to even worse things happening. So we can probably all think of examples. We also want to consider contributing factors, and these may be things that we wouldn't specifically identify as a type of cause, but they do play a role in what happens. The example that they give here on 151 when in the 1990s, it seemed like there was a big outbreak of school violence, and people sometimes will do research to show, no, it's just that the media reported on it, but school violence has always been around. It's just that now the media has gotten more into it and they've sensationalized it. But some people would say, there was a significant outbreak of school violence in the 90s. And they would say, well, here are a list of contributing factors. Divorce, guns, video games, goth culture, bullying, cliques, movies, psychosis, and so on. And basically, none of these are really great causes. None of these things you can really prove cause this, but people would still think of them as contributing factors. Oftentimes, when you really start digging, you can see that it's a real stretch. And again, maybe it's something where these are things that really start piling up, and then there is that, again, the idea of the precipitating cause, the straw that breaks a camel's back. But contributing factors are something that you could list in your paper when you may not have a lot of great proof for it, but you still have a hunch, still have an idea on those things. When you've examined all these different types of causes or contributing factors and all your different ideas, and you're trying to come up with a good explanation for cause and effect, or a thesis statement, and again, plural of thesis is theses, you want to keep these things in mind. And again, we're getting to 151 in our book. You want to come to conclusions thoughtfully. Ruskowitz calls it you're playing detective with the complexities of life, and sometimes that requires some imagination. And you do have to kind of string things together, but again, you want to use your evidence and proof to do that too. You also want to scrutinize your own explanations and conclusions. You don't want to just say, well, because I came up with it, it must be right. You really want to be tough on yourself and push your ideas to where they really, really work. You also want to not oversimplify situations. It's really easy to be simplistic and say, well, those kids in Columbine seem to be listening to loud, violent music, and that just seems like to me, of course, that's going to make people act violently. Well, that's being really oversimplifying, and it's insulting to your readers. Likewise, manipulating facts. You don't want to change things. You don't want to just use one little piece of statistics. You want to, again, maintain your credibility, your ethos that we've been talking about all along.